Hello and welcome to IAMC TV Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Let's explore today's top news headlines from December 27th.
Sounds good.
China's been making waves. They just launched their biggest warship, the Sichuan. It's a Type EC-1076 amphibious assault ship.
Yeah, the Sichuan is a real game changer. Over 40,000 tons makes it one of the largest warships out there. And it's got some serious tech on board, electromagnetic catapults for one.
Electromagnetic catapults, that's a big jump, right?
Yeah.
What's the difference between those and, like, say, the steam catapults on U.S. carriers?
Big difference. Electromagnetic catapults are more efficient, less maintenance, and they can launch aircraft and drones more often. The Sichuan will have some serious power projection capability.
And all this is happening while tensions are already high in the region, especially with Taiwan.
Exactly. It's a clear sign of China's ambitions, and they've got the hardware to back it up. Neighboring countries are definitely going to take notice, and things in the Pacific are about to get even more complicated.
Speaking of complicated, in Nigeria, the army arrested a food vendor, Nura Yakubu, in Taraba State.
Yeah, this is a big deal. They think Yakubu's been supporting Boko Haram, providing shelter, helping with tax, even linked to kidnappings.
Really highlights the ongoing security issues in Nigeria, doesn't it? You never know who might be involved.
It does. Shows how complex these terrorist networks are. Boko Haram relies on these kinds of connections, and it makes them that much harder to fight.
Switching gears a bit. In Israel, Sarah Netanyahu, the prime minister's wife, is under investigation.
These are some serious allegations. Harassment of political opponents, witness intimidation, that sort of thing. And this is all happening while her husband, Prime Minister Netanyahu, is in the middle of his own corruption trial. Fraud, breach of trust, bribery, the whole 9 yards.
So this is adding even more pressure to the prime minister and his family. How do you think this will play out in Israeli politics?
It's going to make things even more divided, that's for sure. The Prime Minister's supporters will likely dismiss this as politically motivated, but his opponents will see it as more evidence of wrongdoing. Could have some real impact on his future, especially with that corruption trial still going on.
Now to a truly heartbreaking story. Nigerian women are facing horrible abuse and exploitation in Iraq. They were promised domestic work, but...
It's awful. They were lured to Iraq with the promise of a better life, and it's turned into modern-day slavery. Working ridiculous hours for little or no pay, many of them are suffering physical, emotional, and even sexual abuse.
The reports are just horrific. Agnes, one of the victims, was raked by her employer and forced to have an abortion. Eniola was tortured with tasers and hot water before she managed to escape.
These stories are just the tip of the iceberg. These women are trapped in a nightmare with almost no way out. It's a terrible example of what can happen with international labor migration, how vulnerable people can be exploited.
Absolutely, it's a wake-up call. We have to do more to protect these vulnerable individuals from falling prey to this kind of exploitation.
Couldn't agree more.
Now, back to Africa. Nigeria's National Security Advisor, Nuhu Ribadu, is denying claims made by Niger's General Abdurrahman Tiani, the leader of the recent coup. Tiani said that Nigeria is working with France to set up a military base in Nigeria.
Well, this denial comes at a really delicate time for the region. After the coup in Niger, there's a lot of tension, suspicion about foreign involvement in Africa. Ribadu wants to distance Nigeria from France and reaffirm their commitment to a peaceful relationship with Niger.
Interesting that Ribadu also mentioned that the U.S. had asked to set up a base in Nigeria, but they were turned down.
Very interesting. It tells you that Nigeria is being careful about allowing foreign military presence. They want to maintain their sovereignty and chart their own course in the region.
Definitely a complex situation. Now to a tragic incident, a plane crash that killed 38 people near Aktau, Kazakhstan.
This was an Azerbaijani Airlines flight heading from Baku to Grozny in Chechnya. It veered off course before crashing, and while the investigation is ongoing, there are a lot of theories floating around. Some sources think a Russian air defense missile might be responsible, though Russia's not saying anything until the investigation wraps up.
Azerbaijan Airlines isn't taking any chances. They've already suspended flights to 7 Russian cities because of safety concerns. This incident is definitely going to add to the tension between Russia and its neighbors.
Absolutely. If the investigation finds evidence of foul play, things could really escalate. It also brings up important questions about aviation safety and accountability, especially in these conflict zones.
Shifting focus to South Korea, which is going through some political turmoil, President Yoon Suk-yeol was recently impeached.
And just to make things even more chaotic, lawmakers impeached the acting president, Duck-Soo, as well. Opposition lawmakers accused him of obstructing Yoon's impeachment process.
So 2 impeachments in a row. What does this tell us about the state of politics in South Korea?
Well, it's a clear sign of deep divisions and a lot of instability. This is completely unprecedented and shows a real power struggle going on. The Constitutional Court will decide what happens to both Yoon and Han, but the outcome is uncertain. South Korea is in a bit of a political limbo right now.
And to add to it all, Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok is now the interim president. That's going to create some economic uncertainty, wouldn't you say?
You bet. This political turmoil is a huge distraction. It could really hinder the government's ability to handle the economy, and that's going to worry investors and international partners.
Our last headline highlights the strained relationship between Russia and the West. A U.S. citizen, Eugene Jean Spector, was sentenced to 15 years in prison in Russia for espionage.
The FSB, Russia's security service, claims Spector was gathering biomedical data for a genetic screening system and that he was working for the Pentagon and some commercial organization. Spector's lawyer says it's not true, but this case is definitely a symptom of the deep mistrust between Russia and the West.
It's a stark reminder of how real these geopolitical tensions are. Individuals can get caught in the middle, and often these cases become bargaining chips in the larger political game.
That's a very good point. These espionage cases take on a bigger meaning. They become symbols of the tension and mistrust between nations, and they show just how complicated and high stakes the world of intelligence gathering really is.
That wraps up our look at today's top news headlines.
A lot to think about, isn't there? From military moves in Asia to political upheaval in South Korea, and then the tragic human costs of conflict and exploitation. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it really is. It's easy to get overwhelmed by all these negative headlines, but it's important to remember there's good happening too.
Right, it's easy to focus on the bad. But there are positive things happening, even if they don't always make the news.
Exactly. Progress isn't always flashy, it takes time, but there are people working hard to make a difference. Speaking of making a difference, what about the international response to some of these situations? Like with those Nigerian women trapped in Iraq, are there any organizations stepping up to help?
Oh, absolutely. Groups like the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, and Anti-Slavery International, they're working hard to fight this kind of exploitation, providing aid, raising awareness, pushing for policy changes.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
And what about South Korea? Have they ever dealt with this kind of political crisis before?
They've had their share of turmoil, but this is a whole new level. The Constitutional Court has a big decision to make, both with President Yoon and acting President Han. It could really change things for South Korea's political future, maybe even lead to early elections.
It sounds like they're in uncharted waters. For people trying to understand all this global news, it can be a lot to process. What advice would you give them?
Well, first off, be critical of what you read and hear. Think about who's giving you the information, what their agenda might be. Look for different perspectives. And don't just skim the headlines, dig deeper, try to get the whole picture.
That's good advice. And what about social media? It's where most people get their news, but there's so much misinformation out there.
It's a double-edged sword, that's for sure. You get instant access to information, but it's easy to get caught in echo chambers, and sometimes it's hard to tell what's real and what's not.
So how can we be smarter about using social media for news? How do we make sure we're getting accurate information?
Be skeptical. Don't just share something because it sounds good. Check the source. Look for evidence. Be careful about anything that's super emotional or dramatic, and try to get information from a few different places, good sources that you trust.
Good point. And I think we all have to be aware of our own biases too. We all have preconceived notions about things, and that can affect how we see the news.
Absolutely. That's where media literacy comes in. We need to know how to evaluate information, how to think for ourselves.
Well said. Any final thoughts for our listeners as they try to make sense of all these complicated global issues?
Stay curious. Keep learning. The world is constantly changing, and it's our job to keep up and be part of the solution. It's true, we can feel helpless sometimes with these big global problems, but we can all do something. Stay informed, talk about these things, support the people trying to make a difference. Little things add up.
Yeah, we can't fix everything, but we can each contribute. Just being aware of these issues, talking about them, that's a good start.
Absolutely. The more we know, the better choices we can make. And that's how we build a better world, a fairer one.
Well said. Thanks for joining me today. It's been a fascinating look at what's happening in the world.
My pleasure. It's important to have these conversations.
And for our listeners, thank you for tuning in to IAMC TV Radio. Stay informed, stay engaged, and remember, even with all the challenges out there, there's always hope, and there are people working hard to make things better. Thank you for listening to the today's top news headlines on IAMC TV Radio.